When medicine gave up, an invisible boy crossed the doors of a hospital, and nothing was ever the same again. The metallic sound of footsteps echoed through St. Jude Hospital's corridor, like a countdown that Henry Wilson could no longer ignore. 43 days. That was how long Clara had been in that state, suspended between two worlds that he couldn't comprehend or control. Henry adjusted the knot of his Hermès tie and checked the Patek Philippe watch on his wrist. 6:30 in the morning. Like every day for the past 6 weeks, he arrived before the doctors, before the day shift nurses, even before the sun had fully risen over the concrete jungle of New York City. The door to room 412 opened with a mechanical whisper. There she was, Clara, his 14-year-old girl who just 2 months ago was running through the gardens of their Greenwich home, complaining about math homework and dreaming of studying veterinary medicine. Now her skin had the pallor of fine porcelain. Her brown hair that was once voluminous and full of life had lost its natural luster, and her chest rose and fell to the rhythm imposed by the machines that kept her breathing. Henry approached the leather armchair he had ordered installed next to the bed. Not just any hospital chair, but an ergonomic Italian armchair that cost more than many people's annual salaries. Still, no material comfort could ease the weight he felt in his chest every time he looked at his daughter. He opened his tablet and began reviewing the overnight medical reports. Blood pressure stable, heart rate within parameters, adequate oxygen saturation. Numbers, always numbers. It was through them that Henry tried to find some logic in the chaos his life had become. Dr. Ethan Tavares, the head of the medical team, had been clear from the start. Clara's acute lymphoblastic leukemia was aggressive, but treatable. The best protocols, the most modern medications, cutting-edge technology. Henry had mobilized resources that few in the country would be able to afford, covering experimental treatments in the United States, bringing European specialists for consultations, investing in research that was still in its initial phase. Money was never the problem, nor was time, nor dedication. But the disease didn't care about cost spreadsheets or execution schedules. The relapses came like furious waves. Every time the tests showed improvement, when the medical team sketched cautious optimism, Clara would relapse even more severely. The last episode had been devastating. Within hours, she went from conscious and talking quietly with her mother to a state of deep unconsciousness that the doctors classified as an induced coma, but which Henry knew was more complex than any technical terminology. The door opened again, and Laura entered silently. Henry didn't lift his eyes from the tablet, but he sensed his wife's presence by the soft fragrance of the perfume she had worn for 15 years, since they were married. Laura approached the other side of the bed and, as she did every morning, stroked Clara's hair with a delicacy that made Henry's heart ache. "Good morning, my girl," Laura whispered, and Henry finally looked up. His wife was thinner, had deep dark circles and an expression he still couldn't fully decipher. Since the onset of the illness, Laura had transformed. The practical and objective woman he had known had given way to someone who sought answers in places Henry considered irrational. "The overnight results are normal," he said, trying to sound reassuring. "All parameters within the expected range." Laura nodded, but Henry noticed her attention was focused on Clara, not the medical data. She held her daughter's hand and closed her eyes for a few seconds, as if saying a silent prayer. Henry returned his concentration to the tablet, but a restlessness was growing in his chest. In recent days, Laura had seemed different, more serene but also more mysterious. She left the hospital at strange hours, returned with an expression he couldn't interpret. The entry of Nurse Carla Nunez interrupted his thoughts. Carla had worked at the hospital for over 15 years and had an impeccable reputation. Henry had personally chosen her to care for Clara, impressed by her resume and recommendations. She was a woman in her 40s, black hair pulled back in a perfect bun, always dressed in impeccably clean uniforms and a professional demeanor that conveyed confidence. "Good morning, Mr. Wilson, Mrs. Laura," Carla greeted, first heading to the machines to check the readings. Clara had a quiet night. No significant changes. Henry watched Carla as she adjusted the tubes and checked the medication. There was something different in her demeanor today, a subtle tension that his eye, trained to detect nuances in negotiations, immediately caught. Carla avoided looking directly into his eyes, which was unusual for someone always so professional and direct. "Any specific concerns I should know about?" Henry asked, closing the tablet. "No, sir. Everything is within the normal range," Carla replied, but her voice carried an almost imperceptible hesitation. Laura stood up and walked to the window overlooking the hospital's inner courtyard. Down below, Henry could see the morning activity. Staff arriving for their shift, some patients in wheelchairs soaking up the sun, family members talking in small groups. It was a microcosm of life that continued its course, while here in room 412, time seemed suspended. "Henry," Laura said without turning around, "have you ever thought that maybe we're looking for answers in the wrong places?" The question caught him off guard. "What do you mean by that?" "We have the best doctors, the best equipment, all the resources money can buy," she continued, still looking out the window. "But perhaps Clara needs something that isn't in the medical records." Henry felt a familiar irritation growing. These were the moments when the fundamental differences between him and Laura became most evident. While he clung to science, data, and rationality, she turned to abstractions he couldn't accept as valid. "Laura, we've talked about this," he said, trying to maintain a controlled tone. "Evidence-based medicine is our best hope. We can't let ourselves be led by what?" She turned around, and Henry saw an intensity in his wife's eyes that he hadn't seen in weeks. "By hope? By faith? By believing there are things we still don't fully understand?" Carla was finishing her notes on the chart, but Henry realized she was listening to the conversation. The nurse seemed torn between discreetly leaving or staying for potential mediation. The atmosphere in the room, already heavy with the tension of Clara's situation, grew even heavier with the non-verbal conflict between the parents. Henry's cell phone rang, interrupting the moment. It was his personal assistant, reminding him of an important meeting scheduled in 2 hours. Wilson Holding didn't stop because Clara was in the hospital, although Henry had delegated far more responsibilities than he usually did. Even so, his presence was necessary for strategic decisions that couldn't wait. "I have to go," he said, putting his phone away. "I'll be back late this afternoon." Laura nodded without saying anything. Henry approached the bed, kissed Clara's forehead, and whispered, "Daddy will be back soon, my princess." As he left the room, he couldn't help but notice that Carla and Laura exchanged a look that lasted only a fraction of a second, but carried a meaning he couldn't decipher. All the way to the office, that look lingered in his mind like a disturbing echo of something happening without his knowledge. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like it. Tell us what city you are watching us from. We'll continue. The light rain falling on New York City that Tuesday afternoon didn't bother David Sanchez. At 8 years old, he had already learned that the city offered shelter to those who knew where to look. Sitting under the awning of the St. Mark Bakery, 3 blocks from St. Jude Hospital, David watched the hurried movement of people passing by, umbrellas in hand, faces closed against the grey weather typical of New York autumn. His clothes were a patchwork of donations, a t-shirt 3 sizes too big, jeans with patches on the knees, and sneakers that knew the streets better than David's feet. Despite his simple appearance, his eyes were a deep brown that seemed to hold secrets too old for someone so young. It was in these eyes that the most attentive people realized David was not just another vulnerable child, but someone with a keen perception of the world around him. He had arrived in that neighborhood 3 weeks ago. After running away from the 4th shelter he had been in since becoming an orphan. Not that the shelters were bad, but David had a need for freedom that institutional walls couldn't contain. On the streets, he felt more connected to something he couldn't explain in words. It was as if he could feel the emotions of the people passing him by, their pain, their joys, their deepest fears. Mrs. Helen, the bakery owner, had grown accustomed to the boy's discreet presence. He never asked for anything directly, but she always set aside some leftover bread from the day before and left it in a discreet bag near the trash can where David could take it without feeling embarrassed. It was a silent agreement between them, based on the mutual kindness that sometimes flourishes in the most unexpected places in the metropolis. At that moment, David was particularly watching a woman leaving the hospital. She walked slowly, as if carrying an invisible weight on her shoulders. She wore expensive clothes, but was disheveled in a way that only those who know deep pain can recognize. Slightly unkempt blonde hair, reddish eyes, a countenance that alternated between hope and despair. It was Laura, although David didn't know her name yet. Something in that woman's suffering touched David deeply. Without fully understanding why, he got up and began to follow her from a distance. Laura entered the chapel annexed to the hospital. a small ecumenical space where patients' families often sought spiritual solace. David hesitated at the entrance, but an inner force he couldn't name compelled him to enter too. The chapel was empty, except for Laura, who knelt in the first pew and began to cry silently. Her tears were those of someone who had cried a lot, but still found reserves of sadness for moments like that. David sat discreetly in the last pew watching. He didn't know how to pray in the traditional way he had learned in the Catholic shelters he had passed through. But he closed his eyes and concentrated all his positive thoughts in the direction of that suffering woman. Laura remained there for more than 20 minutes. When she finally got up to leave, she noticed the boy's presence. Their eyes met, and at that moment, something inexplicable happened. David felt an immediate connection to her pain, as if he could absorb a little of that suffering to alleviate it. Laura, in turn, saw an ancient wisdom in the boy's eyes that contrasted with his apparent age. "Are you okay, dear?" Laura asked, approaching carefully. "I should be asking you that," David replied, and his voice had a maturity that surprised Laura. She sat next to him on the pew. For a few minutes they sat in silence, sharing a wordless communion of pain and compassion. Finally, Laura broke the silence. "My daughter is very sick," she said, as if she needed to verbalize that reality to someone. "I know," David replied simply. "I can feel your sadness from afar." Laura looked at him in surprise. There was something in the naturalness with which the boy spoke about feelings that made her question whether she was in the presence of an ordinary child. "What is your name?" David Sanchez." "I'm Laura." She extended her hand, which David shook with a gentleness she didn't expect to find in someone who clearly lived on the streets. During the conversation that followed, Laura discovered David's story. Orphaned since he was 6, when his parents were in a car accident, he had passed through a series of shelters without ever fully adapting. Not out of rebellion or difficult behavior, but because he felt an almost physical need to help suffering people, and that was rarely understood or accepted by institutions. "Sometimes I feel like I can help when people are sad or in pain," David explained, looking at his own hands. "I don't know how to explain it, but when I touch someone who is suffering and I think very hard about them getting well, sometimes they get a little better." Laura felt a shiver run down her spine. In recent weeks, she had visited traditional healers, alternative therapists, and had sought hope for Clara in various spiritual traditions. And now here was an 8-year-old boy talking naturally about something adults around him would consider delusion or fantasy. "Would you like to meet my daughter?" Laura asked, surprised by her own question. David's eyes lit up. "Is she at the hospital?" "Yes, on the 4th floor. She's been sleeping for many weeks." David nodded as if he perfectly understood the gravity of the situation. "I would really like to meet her." "What is her name?" Clara Wilson." At that moment, David closed his eyes and remained silent for a few seconds. Laura watched him, intrigued. When he opened his eyes again, there was a determination in them that she hadn't expected to see. "Clara doesn't want to sleep that long," David said. "She's trying to wake up, but she needs help." The boy's words hit Laura like a lightning bolt. It was exactly what her mother's heart had been screaming for weeks. Against all medical opinion, against Henry's rationality, against the evidence from the machines, Clara was there fighting to return. "How can you know that?" Laura asked, her voice choked with emotion. "I can't explain it," David answered honestly. "But since we started talking, I can feel her. It's like she's asking someone to believe that she's still really here." Laura felt the tears return, but now they were tears of a hope she hadn't felt in a long time. She looked at David, at that boy life had put in her path so improbably, and made a decision that would change everything. "David, you need to meet someone. A very special person who takes care of Clara. She can help us." The boy nodded, confident. He didn't know exactly what awaited him, but he felt that this meeting in the chapel had not been accidental. There was a greater force orchestrating those events, leading him toward a purpose he didn't yet fully comprehend, but which his soul had already accepted. Laura stood up and held out her hand to David. "Come on, dear. It's time for you to meet Carla." They left the chapel together, the rain had stopped, and the first rays of afternoon sun began to break through the heavy clouds, creating an almost cinematic effect over the grey city. For David, that light seemed like a sign that something important was about to happen. The meeting between David and Carla took place in the hospital cafeteria. a neutral space where important conversations could occur without arousing suspicion. Laura had carefully chosen the time, knowing that Carla finished her shift at 4 in the afternoon and usually stopped for coffee before leaving. The nurse arrived punctually, still wearing her impeccable uniform, but with the typical fatigue of someone who had spent 8 hours caring for critically ill patients. When Carla spotted Laura sitting at a corner table accompanied by a child, her initial expression was curiosity, quickly followed by concern. She knew well that look on the faces of patients' family members, the desperate search for alternatives that conventional medicine didn't offer. She had seen many parents in this situation over 15 years of her profession. "Laura, is everything all right?" Carla asked, approaching the table cautiously. "Carla, thank you for coming. I need to introduce you to someone very special," Laura said, gesturing for the nurse to sit down. "This is David." The boy looked up from the hot chocolate Laura had bought him and greeted Carla with a shy nod, but his brown eyes remained fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel slightly uncomfortable. It was as if he could see through the professional facade she maintained and perceive the doubts and anxieties she carried. "Hi, David," Carla replied, sitting down. "Nice to meet you." Laura took a deep breath before continuing. She knew what she was about to propose would sound absurd to someone with Carla's scientific background, but something inside her screamed that this was the only real hope they had. "Carla, I know this will sound strange, but David has a special gift. He can help people who are suffering, especially sick children." Carla's expression hardened slightly. As a healthcare professional, she was used to family members clinging to any hope, no matter how irrational. But there was something in Laura's serious tone that made her suppress the initial reaction of skepticism. "Laura, I understand your desperation, but—" "Please," David interrupted, his voice soft but firm. "You take care of Clara, don't you?" Carla nodded, surprised by the boy's maturity. "I can feel her from here," David continued, closing his eyes for a moment. "She's on the 4th floor, isn't she? A room that ends with the number 2. Carla's eyes widened. St. Jude Hospital was huge, with hundreds of rooms, and she hadn't mentioned anything about Clara or her location. "How do you—" "She doesn't want to be sleeping," David said, opening his eyes again. "She's trying to talk, but no one can hear. She gets more agitated when her dad gets very nervous in the room." Carla felt a shiver run down her spine. In recent days, she had noticed small variations in Clara's monitors that coincided exactly with Henry's moments of greatest tension. Variations too subtle to be considered clinically significant, but constant enough to grab her professional attention. "Have you observed changes in her vital signs?" David asked, as if he could read Carla's thoughts. Yes, small changes. Nothing the doctors consider relevant," Carla admitted, feeling strangely compelled to be honest with that boy. "She is trying to show that she is there," David explained. "But she needs someone to believe in her. Someone who talks to her for real, not just as if she were a sick body." Laura held Carla's hand across the table. "Carla, I know it sounds impossible, but what if there's a chance, a possibility that David can make a difference? You wouldn't lose anything by letting him try." The nurse remained silent for long minutes, processing what she was hearing. Her scientific training screamed against all of it, but 15 years of caring for patients had taught her that medicine didn't have all the answers. There were inexplicable cases, recoveries that defied all logic, moments when the human factor seemed to transcend the limits of science. "Even if I wanted to help," she finally said, "it would be impossible. Mr. Wilson is very strict about access to Clara's room. Only family and authorized medical staff." David leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "What if it was during the night, when there's less movement?" Carla looked at him, surprised by the pragmatism of the suggestion. "Are you serious?" "I don't need much time," David explained. "Just a few minutes to talk to her, so she knows someone believes she is. There, sometimes that's enough." The nurse looked alternately at David and Laura, feeling torn between hospital protocol and a growing intuition that this child was not ordinary. There was something about his presence that emanated an almost palpable tranquility, an energy she had never felt before. "If I did this," Carla said slowly, "and someone found out, I would lose my job. I could even lose my professional license." "I understand," David replied, "but what if Clara got better? Not completely better, but gave signs that she is returning. Wouldn't it be worth the risk?" Laura squeezed Carla's hand tighter. "Carla, do you have children?" "I have a 12-year-old girl," the nurse replied. "Then you understand," Laura said, her eyes welling up. "You understand what a mother is capable of doing for her daughter." Carla closed her eyes and sighed deeply. 15 years of her profession, an impeccable reputation, the financial stability that supported her own daughter. She was about to risk everything based on the word of an 8-year-old boy she had met less than an hour ago. It was complete madness. "All right," she finally said, "but with strict conditions. Only one attempt. If it doesn't work or if there's any complication, never again. And this stays between the three of us. No one else can know." Laura's face lit up with a gratitude that made Carla question if she wasn't making the right decision. David simply nodded as if he already knew she would agree. "When?" Laura asked. "Tonight," Carla replied. "The night shift has fewer nurses, and I can figure out a way to distract security." "But it will be quick, 15 minutes at most." "That's enough," David said, standing up from the chair. "Clara will be happy to know someone believes in her." As she left the cafeteria, Carla looked back and saw David and Laura walking together down the hospital corridor. There was something in that image that touched her deeply. A desperate woman who had found hope in an abandoned child, and a child who carried on his thin shoulders a wisdom that transcended his age. That night, for the first time in weeks, Carla had difficulty sleeping, not out of anxiety or fear of the possible consequences of her actions, but because a part of her, a part that had been dormant for years of medical routine and rigid protocols, had been awakened by the unwavering faith of a boy who promised to talk to a girl in a coma, as if she could hear him. And maybe, Carla thought before finally falling asleep, she really could. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like it. Tell us what city you're watching us from. We'll continue. The early morning at St. Jude Hospital had a peculiar silence, broken only by the constant hum of medical equipment and the whisper of the night shift professionals' footsteps. At 2:30 in the morning, Carla made her routine rounds on the pediatric intensive care unit, checking each patient with the meticulousness of someone who would never allow a detail to go unnoticed. David was waiting at the hospital service entrance, as agreed. Laura had picked him up from where he usually slept, under the awning of a nearby supermarket, and had brought him there. The boy was wearing a clean t-shirt that Laura had bought on the way, but his eyes showed a deep concentration, as if he were mentally preparing for something very important. "Remember," Carla said in a low voice, leading him through the less busy corridors, 15 minutes maximum. If anyone shows up, you hide in the bathroom next to the room until I signal that it's safe." David nodded, following her in silence. Each step he took toward room 412 seemed to amplify a feeling he had felt since the afternoon, an invisible connection to someone who needed help. It was as if Clara were calling for him, even without knowing of his existence. The room door opened with the same mechanical whisper that Henry heard every morning. Carla entered first, quickly checked the machines and motioned for David to approach. The boy paused for a few seconds on the doorway, observing Clara for the first time. She looked even more fragile than he had imagined. Her pale skin contrasted with the brown hair spread on the pillow, and her chest rose and fell at the controlled rhythm of the ventilator. But David noticed something the doctors couldn't detect, a subtle, almost imperceptible energy emanating from her. Clara was there present, just trapped in a body that could no longer respond to her will. "Hi, Clara," David said softly, approaching the bed. "My name is David. Your mom told me about you." Carla watched, fascinated, as the boy pulled a chair up to the bed and sat down completely naturally, as if visiting a friend who might respond at any moment. "I know you're in there," David continued, gently holding Clara's hand. "Everyone thinks you can't hear, but I know you can. I can feel you trying to talk." Carla quickly looked at the monitors. There was a subtle yet perceptible variation in Clara's heart rate, nothing that would set off alarms, but definitely different from the constant pattern of the last few weeks. David closed his eyes and remained silent for a few minutes, holding Clara's hand with both of his. Carla had never witnessed anything like it. It wasn't like the conventional prayers she saw family members doing next to the beds, nor like the medical procedures she was accustomed to. It was something completely different, a form of communication that transcended words. "You're scared," David finally said, without opening his eyes. "Scared of not being able to come back?" Scared of making your mom sad, scared your dad can't take it anymore. But you don't have to be afraid. I'm here to help. Carla's eyes widened when she realized tears were streaming down Clara's face. Real tears, silent but unequivocally present. In 15 years of her profession, she had never seen a patient in a deep coma cry so consciously. She's crying, Carla whispered. Approaching. They are tears of relief, David explained, opening his eyes and smiling gently at Clara. Finally, someone knows she's here. For the next 10 minutes, David talked to Clara about simple things. The weather outside, the people walking through the hospital corridors, funny stories he made up on the spot. Carla watched, mesmerized, as the monitors recorded small but consistent variations in the girl's vital signs. They weren't dramatic changes, but they were responses. Clara was responding. It has to be your dad who allows you to come back, David said at a certain point, his voice becoming more serious. He's so afraid of losing you that he forgot to believe you're still here. But we're going to help him remember, okay? It was at that moment that they heard footsteps in the corridor. Carla immediately recognized the sound. It was the determined, fast strides of Henry Wilson. She looked at her watch, 3:15 in the morning. It was unusual for him to show up at that hour. Quick, she whispered to David, in the bathroom, now. But it was too late. The door opened, and Henry entered the room, stopping abruptly when he saw the boy next to his daughter's bed. His expression quickly changed from surprise to absolute fury. What the hell is going on here? He roared, his voice echoing through the silent room. David stood up slowly without letting go of Clara's hand. He showed no fear, only a strange calm that irritated Henry even more. Sir, Carla tried, I can explain. Explain what? Henry approached, his face red with anger. That you allowed a complete stranger, a street child, into my daughter's room in the middle of the night? Have you completely lost your mind, Carla? He is not a stranger, David said calmly, finally letting go of Clara's hand. And your daughter is not just a sick body. She is alive, sir. She is trying to come back, but she needs you to believe in her. Henry looked at the boy as if he had lost his sanity. Security, he shouted, turning to the door. I want this kid removed from the hospital immediately. Mr. Wilson, please, Carla pleaded. Let me explain. You're fired, Henry said coldly. Effective immediately. I want you out of this hospital before dawn. 2 security guards entered the room and headed toward David, but the boy offered no resistance. Before being led out, he turned to Henry with an expression of compassion that the executive didn't expect. Your daughter loves you very much, David said. She doesn't want you to suffer so much. She just wants you to believe she's still here waiting to return. The words hit Henry like a punch to the stomach, but his anger was stronger than any other emotion. Get this kid out of my sight, he ordered the guards. When David was removed from the room, Henry turned to Clara's monitors. His heart skipped a beat when he noticed something he hadn't noticed in recent days. Clara's vital signs were slightly more stable and stronger than in previous weeks. But he refused to make any connection between this improvement and the boy's presence. These are coincidences, he muttered to himself, adjusting the chair next to the bed. Normal variations. But when he held Clara's hand for the first time in weeks, he felt something different, an almost imperceptible pressure, as if she were trying to squeeze his hand back. Henry looked at his daughter's face and saw that the tears were still drying on her cheeks. This is not possible, he whispered, but his voice carried more doubt than certainty. The days that followed David's expulsion from the hospital were marked by a silent tension that seemed to permeate every corner of room 412. Henry had hired a new nurse, Sandra Oliveira, a competent professional, but without the affection and dedication Carla showed for Clara. Laura, in turn, could barely look at her husband without feeling a mixture of disillusionment and revolt that grew with every hour. Carla had left without making a scene, taking only her personal belongings and the certainty that she had witnessed something extraordinary. Before leaving the hospital for good, she sought out Laura and handed her a notebook where she had meticulously recorded all the variations in Clara's vital signs during the previous 3 weeks. Keep this, Carla said, hugging Laura in the hospital parking lot. One day you'll need to show someone that Clara was really responding. Laura leafed through the notebook with tears in her eyes. Page after page of precise notes, hand-drawn graphs, detailed observations about small changes that no doctor had considered significant. It was tangible proof that her daughter was not just a body artificially kept alive, but a person fighting to return. David, in turn, hadn't completely disappeared. Every morning, Laura found him sitting on a bench in a small park in front of the hospital, looking intently at the fourth-floor window where Clara was admitted. The boy never asked for anything, never complained about being expelled. He just stayed there, like a silent guardian, keeping a vigil that deeply touched Laura's heart. "You don't have to stay here every day," she said one morning, sitting next to him on the bench. "I have to," David replied simply. "Clara knows I'm here. Even from afar, she can feel that someone still believes in her." Laura observed the boy's serious face and realized he had matured even more in the last few days. The experience at the hospital, Henry's hostility, the humiliating expulsion, all of it had left visible marks in his eyes, but had not broken his determination. "David," Laura said hesitantly, "are you sure you can help my daughter? I'm not doubting you, but I need to know if there's a real chance or if we're clinging to an impossible hope." The boy was silent for a few minutes, watching the people entering and leaving the hospital. Finally, he turned to Laura with an expression more mature than any 8-year-old should have. "Mrs. Laura, I can't really explain how what I do works. I just know that when I touch a sick person and think very strongly about their well-being, sometimes something happens. It's not magic, it's not a miracle. It's like I remind the person's body of what it's like to be well." Laura nodded, encouraging him to continue. "With Clara it was different," David continued. "When I held her hand, it was like she told me a lot of things without saying anything. She's tired of being asleep, but she's afraid of hurting you if she can't really get well. She knows her dad is suffering a lot and that makes her weaker." David's words echoed in Laura's mind all the way back home. That night, she found Henry in his office, reviewing medical reports for the 1,000th time as if he could find a solution in the numbers that the country's best specialists hadn't been able to offer. "Henry, we need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her. "If it's about that boy," he began without looking up from the papers. "It's about our daughter," Laura interrupted, with a firmness that finally made Henry look at her. "And about what we're doing to her. What are we doing?" He stood up from the chair, his voice filled with indignation. "We are giving her the best medical treatment available in the country. We are doing everything humanly possible." "Are we?" Laura countered. "Or are you trying to control a situation that is beyond your control, as you've always done with everything in life?" The accusation hit Henry like a slap. "Laura, this is no time for marital arguments. Our daughter is alive," Laura said, pulling Carla's notebook from her purse. "And there is evidence that she has been trying to communicate with us. Evidence you refuse to see." Henry reluctantly took the notebook and began to flip through it. Page after page of meticulously recorded data, graphs that showed patterns in Clara's vital signs variations, notes about subtle responses to external stimuli. It was the work of a serious professional, not the delusions of a desperate person. "These are normal variations," Henry said, but his voice no longer sounded so convinced. "Fluctuations that happen naturally in any patient." "Look at the dates and times," Laura insisted. Carla noted everything. "The most significant variations always happened when you were very tense in the room, or when I talked affectionately with Clara, or when—" She hesitated. "When David was there." Henry closed the notebook abruptly. "Laura, I understand you're desperate. I am too. But I cannot accept putting our daughter's life in the hands of a street boy who pretends to have supernatural powers." "What if they weren't supernatural powers?" Laura asked. "What if it was just love, genuine compassion, the ability to believe when everyone else has given up?" The question hung in the air between them. Henry sat back down, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of exhaustion that Laura hadn't seen in a long time. Beneath the armor of the relentless executive, she could glimpse the vulnerable man hidden beneath, the father who was losing the only thing in life that truly mattered. "Laura," he finally said, his voice lower, "I can't risk it. If anything happens to Clara because of my negligence, I will never forgive myself. I prefer for them to hate me for being inflexible than to despise me for being irresponsible." "But what if something happens to Clara because you were too inflexible?" Laura countered. "What if she really is trying to come back, but needs something that medicine can't offer?" Henry didn't answer immediately. He looked out the office window, where he could see the city lights stretching to the horizon. Somewhere out there, the boy who had touched his daughter was probably sleeping on the street without any comfort or security. And in the hospital, Clara remained in the same bed, connected to the same machines, living the same situation for almost 2 months. "What do you want me to do?" he finally asked. "I want you to go talk to David," Laura said. "You don't have to believe him. You don't have to allow him to touch Clara again. Just talk. Look him in the eyes and tell me if you really think he is a threat to our daughter." Henry remained silent for long minutes. 2 decades building an empire based on data, analysis, and rational decisions. Now his wife was asking him to gamble the most precious thing he had on the word of an abandoned child. "Where is he?" he finally asked, and Laura knew she had managed to plant a seed of doubt in her husband's hardened heart. "In the small park in front of the hospital," she replied. "As always. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like it. Tell us what city you are watching us from. We'll continue." It was a cold Saturday morning when Henry Wilson walked for the first time toward the small park where David spent his days. The executive had stayed up all night, repeatedly flipping through Carla's notebook, trying to find a rational explanation for the patterns jumping off the pages. But every graph, every careful note, every detailed observation pointed to the same disturbing conclusion. Clara had been more responsive in recent weeks than in the entire period before. David was exactly where Laura had said he would be, sitting on the same bench, looking at the hospital's 4th-floor window. He was wearing the same T-shirt Laura had bought, now faded from days of use, and his bare feet swung a few inches above the ground. Despite his young age, there was a dignity in his posture that Henry hadn't noticed on the night of the expulsion. "David," Henry said, approaching cautiously. The boy turned around, showing no surprise at seeing Clara's father. It was as if he already knew this meeting would happen sooner or later. "Hi, sir," David simply greeted, gesturing for Henry to sit next to him on the bench. For a few minutes they sat in silence, both looking at the hospital. Henry discreetly observed the boy, looking for signs of imbalance, fantasy, or manipulation. But what he saw was a serene child, with eyes that seemed to carry experiences far beyond his 8 years. "Why do you do this?" Henry finally asked. "Why do you come here every day?" "Because Clara needs it," David replied, as if the answer were obvious. "She gets sad when she doesn't feel like someone out here is rooting for her. Do you really believe you can talk to my daughter, even though she's in a coma?" David turned to look directly at him. "Do you really believe she is no longer there just because she can't speak?" The question caught Henry off guard. It was exactly the kind of simple logic he had spent months trying to avoid. "David," Henry said, choosing his words carefully, "my wife thinks you have a special gift, that you can help sick people. Is that true?" The boy was thoughtful for a moment. "I don't know if it's a gift. My grandmother, before she passed away, used to say that some people are born with their hearts more open to feel the pain of others. Maybe it's just that. But have you really been able to help other people?" "Some," David admitted. "Not always, and not in the way people expect. Sometimes I help by reminding the person that they are not alone. Sometimes I help by showing that someone believes they can get better. Sometimes," he stopped, looking at his own hands, "sometimes something happens that I can't explain." Henry studied the boy's face, looking for signs of lying or fantasy. What he found was a disconcerting honesty, a simplicity that contrasted with the complexity of his own life. "If I let you see Clara again," Henry said slowly, "what would you do?" "I would talk to her," David replied immediately. "I would tell her that her dad finally believes she's there. That would make her very happy." "How can you be so sure?" "Because that's what she told me when I held her hand that night." Henry felt a shiver run down his spine. There was something in the naturalness with which David spoke about Clara that was both disturbing and comforting. "David," Henry said, "I am a man who works with facts, with concrete data. Everything in my life is based on evidence and measurable results. What you are asking me to believe goes against everything I am." "I'm not asking you to change who you are," David countered. "I'm just asking you to remember that Clara is your daughter before she is a patient, and that sometimes daughters need their fathers to believe in them, even when they can't prove they deserve that trust." The words hit Henry like a revelation. For 2 months he had treated Clara as a business problem to be solved, a project that needed the best resources and the best management. He had forgotten to treat her simply as his daughter. At that moment, Henry's cell phone rang. It was Sandra, the new nurse. "Mr. Wilson," the tense voice on the other end of the line said, "you need to come to the hospital immediately. Clara has shown a sudden change in her vital signs." Henry's heart pounded. What kind of change? A significant drop in blood pressure and heart rate. "The doctors are evaluating—" Henry hung up the phone and stood up abruptly. "I have to go," he said to David, already walking toward the hospital. "Can I go with you, sir?" the boy asked, running after him. Henry stopped. All his instincts screamed to leave David where he was, not to mix irrational hopes with a real medical emergency. But something in the urgency of the situation, or perhaps in the boy's genuinely worried expression, made him hesitate. "Come," he finally said. They ran together through the hospital corridors, David managing to keep up with Henry's long strides with impressive determination. When they arrived at room 412, they found a scene that made Henry's heart freeze. Clara was paler than ever, surrounded by doctors and nurses, the monitors showing alarming numbers. "What happened?" Henry asked Dr. Ethan. "A sudden and inexplicable deterioration," the doctor replied, checking the chart. "Vital signs began to drop about an hour ago, with no apparent cause." Henry looked at Clara, his daughter, his princess, and for the first time in 2 months, he allowed himself to feel not like an executive facing a crisis, but like a desperate father who was about to lose the most important person in his life. "Please," he said, turning to David, his voice choked, "if you really can do something, do it now." David approached the bed without hesitation. The doctors looked questioningly at Henry, who gestured for them to allow the boy to approach. David held Clara's hand with both of his and closed his eyes. "Clara," he said softly, "your dad is here. He finally understood that you never really left. He believes in you now. He is waiting for you to come back." What happened in the following minutes would defy any medical explanation the people present would later try to give. The monitors began to show a gradual stabilization of Clara's vital signs. Her breathing, which had become irregular, returned to a more constant pattern. Her blood pressure began to rise slowly. And then, for the first time in almost 2 months, Clara opened her eyes.
"Daddy?"
she whispered, her voice weak but unequivocally present. Henry approached the bed, tears streaming freely down his face. "I'm here, my princess. Daddy is here." Clara smiled weakly and squeezed David's hand. "Thank you," she said to him. "You didn't give up on me." In the days that followed, Clara's recovery was slow but consistent. The doctors had no explanation for what had happened, classifying it as a spontaneous remission that, although rare, was not impossible in medicine. Henry didn't discuss the medical terminology, but knew deep in his heart that he had witnessed something that transcended protocols and charts. David continued to visit Clara during her recovery, but now as an official guest of the family. Henry had not only rehired Clara, but also provided temporary foster care for David in a welcoming family, ensuring the boy could attend school and have the childhood he deserved. 6 months later, Clara was fully recovered. Tests no longer showed signs of the disease, and she had returned to dreaming of becoming a veterinarian. Henry had changed deeply, learning to balance his analytical nature with an openness to mysteries that life sometimes presents. And David continued to be the same special boy, now with a family that loved and supported him in his unique gift of seeing hope where others saw only despair. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Clara, Henry, Laura, and little David has touched your hearts as deeply as it touched ours. This emotional journey teaches us that sometimes miracles come to us through the most unexpected people, and that true love can transcend even the limits of science. If this narrative has awakened in you the same emotion we felt when telling it, don't forget to subscribe to our channel to receive more stories like this. Leave your like if you believe in the power of hope and faith, and in the comments, share with us your own experiences with special people who have crossed your paths. Every day we bring unique stories that celebrate the human capacity to love, believe, and never give up. Until our next story,